you are or have been called avoidant, or you know someone who has, and it can really be difficult. I know. And I have worked with a lot of people over the last couple years, especially the last 3, since I began making videos on social media and online and on YouTube. I've had a lot of avoidant people reach out to me who really want to work on their attachment style and their patterns. And so as I said in yesterday's video, I don't like to pathologize attachment patterns. We all can have our main style, I believe, and lean into other styles. And I like the idea of using colors. I'll talk more about this idea where we think about, certain colors as certain patterns. So we're not just saying, oh, you're avoidant and you're all bad, because the truth is most of us have parts of ourselves that lean into the other patterns. So I might have a part of me that is anxious and a part that is avoidant. My primary caregiver, my mother, my father, the main person, parts of them were secure or safe, it felt like. Parts were very dangerous and were disorganized. Parts were avoidant, right? So it helps us understand, I think, sometimes not just ourselves, but our partners. And that is the goal of the course I'm working on at some point, to help you, if you want to learn more about your own attachment style, becoming a master, so you understand your nervous system, your body, your core wounds, your core beliefs, and how all that plays out first and foremost in you, and secondarily what happens in your partnerships. So today we're talking about the more dismissing. It's often called avoidant or dismissing. So when we're looking at this style, what we're really talking about is the experience of a child feeling rejected, but not necessarily being overtly rejected. And so what do I mean by that? What I mean is that what the research shows for these kids is that these kids learned really early on that for a number of reasons, the parents' emotional difficulties, their own trauma, their own mental health, their own absence, whatever it was, that their bids for connection, their needs for the parent to be responsive to them, those actions, those behaviors, those emotions were often dismissed, minimized, avoided, whatever, and the child interprets those things, those responses, as rejection. So it's not so simple as, oh, you were emotionally neglected and completely rejected, that's why you're avoidant. It's a complicated dynamic where the parents were not really available emotionally at a minimum, and physically in other ways, mentally. And the child's attempts to do that, the child learns fairly early on that that is not how I get my needs met. So a good example of this is, let's say that I have a more avoidant parent and they don't really like it when I'm super clingy, and the research shows that, when I'm really emotional and all of that. They like it when I play nicely by myself, when I deal with my own feelings. So I learned that when I freak out, they're not really going to handle that very well, but they're going to love it when I play quietly next to them. And so what happens is they become really autonomous, hyper-independent, often compulsively self-reliant. And as I've said in the strange situation research, these were the kids who, when they were in the room with the new toys and the researcher, when mommy would get up and leave the room at some point and leave them there, these are kids under the age of around 2, a little under 2-ish, they would watch her with their eyes, and on the outside, their faces didn't seem to register. They weren't crying and having meltdowns. They weren't freaking out that she left. But when we measured their heart rates and their cortisol levels, they were just as upset inside as the babies who were freaking out more, who cried more, the more anxious babies, whatever. But they had already learned that that doesn't really work, and so they didn't necessarily have an outward expression. And that is what is often happening, is many of them at times have really shut down emotion in general, and for them it's hard to get to, and they can get what they will call, and I've also called foggy. A lot of clients will say this when they try to tap into emotion. But also I've seen a lot of clients who actually had parents who were emotionally unsafe, like raging, and their outward style would be called avoidant, or the blue color. But really what it is it is that, but it is also that they have learned that the only way to deal with that freaking out inside is to be alone, because their idea of being with other human beings is stressful, like mommy was stressful. And so that it looks like a complete shutdown. But oftentimes when you get them talking in therapy, there's a lot more that they're aware of. It's just they have a really hard time expressing that to partners. And there's a big difference in those people who are working on their attachment patterns, especially avoidance, and those who are not. So this style is largely the outcome of consistent and repetitive rejection of the child's attachment behavior by the primary figure. And this results, like I said, in deactivation, and that basically means, as opposed to hyperactivation and anxious attachment, I'm going to stop asking for certain needs to be met. I'm going to take care of things myself. And as a result, these kids were often left in what they call a painful state of mind for long periods of time. And so they learn to distract themselves, to numb, to say, I don't need anyone's help, to live in this dreamy like world of auto-regulation, a lot of dissociation or fantasy. And they're sort of like self-soothing on their own. Now, on the outside, they look very oftentimes confident and they can express high confidence, but they have this self-image that is a little more actually consistent and full and positive than a more anxious style or pattern. But deep inside, it looks positive, I should say, but deep inside it is more negative. So it looks more like confident and positive. But deep inside, there's a lot of worthiness issues, a lot of fear of their their lack of value as human beings. So what they tend to do is deny their needs. They tend to want to avoid anything around vulnerability and intimacy and neediness that feels like weakness to them. And because at the same time in their nervous systems, as opposed to the more anxious style, they're not looking for others to calm and soothe. You know, those who have hyperactivation are kind of looking to the other person to help soothe what's happening inside. Those with avoidant attachment patterns are more likely to say, no, I need to be alone, right? I need to deal with my own self. And so they have two main goals. While they are often denying their attachment needs with you, with themselves, and that looks like compulsive self-reliance, they often have two main goals: gaining whatever they need while also maintaining distance, control, and self-reliance. And number two, ignoring or denying needs and avoiding negative emotional states that might trigger activation. So think about that. They're actively trying to not do things that will trigger their need, because deep inside, regardless of what they've learned to do, they are human beings who have needs to be seen and to be accepted and mirrored and safely attached, but they don't want to get near that. And that is why oftentimes when that starts to happen in a relationship, they start to go. So they can be seen as cold and aloof. They're often not that way, but it's just that that's how they've learned to present and stay safe. They often are cut off from their own emotions, so there can be that separateness. But remember that what they're trying to do is often maximize the thoughtful, cognitive parts of themselves and minimize the emotional parts of themselves, because that is so triggering. So they will do things like strive for self-reliance and independence, suppress painful thoughts and negative memories, lack of cognitive accessibility to negative self-representations. So they're trying not to connect to the negative parts of self, projection of negative traits onto others, failure to acknowledge negative emotions and denial of their own basic fears, and wish to retain closeness but are more concerned with bolstering a strong autonomous self. So the root of this is, as I said, going back to if you feel like your bids for connection, the needs you're kind of displaying to the parent are being minimized, rejected, avoided, and you learn very early on to take care of yourself, what you've learned is that you can take care of yourself. And I have said this again and again, is that there is a strength to this attachment style, which is that there's a lot of amazingness in your ability to take care of yourself, that you can take risks, that you can assess situations, that you can be independent and go do things on your own. There's a lot of really strengths in this style. It's just that when it becomes your primary way of relating, so much deactivation and sort of pushing away, but you long for deeper, more authentic, safe connection, that is where it becomes a problem. Or you found yourself in a relationship and you refuse to see that this is not working for your partner and you're not open to working on it. And I've worked with, honestly, it has just been a lot of men more often than not. Historically, more women in my practice, but when I started doing this, a lot of men have reached out to me online, and it's been amazing to see them really come to terms with sort of how they operate and to really start to open up. And even though they'll say, yeah, I did that thing again where I was super shut down, I went back and I talked to my partner about it, and if we're getting closer, it really is. Like, all of us have stuff to work on. So unless you are a full-on avoidant type person who just is walking around the earth, hurting people, ghosting them, not responding, which is also, I get it, part of your own wound. But if you are doing that and you don't want to keep doing that, right? There are places where I think it's important to know that most people are just doing things to survive. I'm not saying it makes it okay or justifies hurtful behavior, but for many of them, they don't want to stay in that. And it's also not your job as a partner to fix them, but we do know that there's a relational reciprocity and healing that can happen together. So I think it's a combination of oftentimes therapy, their own education, reading, books, podcasts, courses, as well as working with their partners. But I will say that for many of them, I think what happens in therapy is they experience me or their therapist as a safe attachment experience that can then oftentimes, it's just a little bit, but then be applied to other relationships. And so it's a safe place for the first time for many of them in their entire lives to be fully honest about who they are and what they feel. And that includes, their themselves during intimacy, how they manage their aloneness, how they behave, and really the wounds they carry. But don't forget that with every single one of these styles, there are things we learn that can be helpful and help us survive. And at the core, they did help us survive. So we never want to completely just feel bad about that, because for many of us, it's the only reason why we're still here, So anyway, thank you for being here. Please consider subscribing, and I will see you. I'm posting every day right now, at least I'm trying to. I will see you tomorrow. Take care and stay safe. Bye.